and thank you all for the invitation. It's exciting to be here and quite intimidating. Looking at the breadth and depth of the research going on, I had difficulty figuring out what I wanted to discuss, and the invitation was about artificial social intelligence. But given the nature of the research going on, and when I reviewed the portfolio, I decided to broaden it a bit. So the first half is going to be about research that my colleagues and I have been doing on team cognition. And then the second half is going to be where we've been moving that into the space of artificial intelligence and the development of essentially AI capable of working as a member of a team. So the first part, I'm also going to provide a bit of history here because I know this is a really interdisciplinary center or cluster, and people may not be familiar with some of the history going on with the study of groups. So I'll be talking a little bit about that, and then more specifically focusing on research that my colleagues and I have been developing in this area we call macrocognition in teams. We'll take a little bit of detour and talk about some service that we've been doing over the years because I think that's too often an ignored contribution that scientists should be thinking about as a member of the scientific ecosystem that is a service we do to society. So I'll be promoting this idea of service, and I want to encourage people to also think about the kind of services that they can do, not simply to the public, but to their own scholarly societies. And then the last half is going to be on studies we've been doing in artificial social intelligence, the real reason that I was invited. So I took some license and I decided to introduce a bit of the history here because it is kind of interesting. When you look back on the study of cognition in groups and teams, it actually has a very long history. And there were studies being published in the early 1900s in psychology journals where even though they didn't call it cognition, they were clearly studying cognitive processes. So Allport was looking at the influence of the group on the association of thought. Margaret Shaw, one of my favorite early studies, a comparison of individuals with small groups and the rational solution to complex problems. Thorndike, who I'm sure many people here recognize that name, on what type of a task will a group do well. I mentioned Shaw. I really like that one because Shaw was one of the first to carefully compare what we could consider the cognitive outcomes of an individual versus a team, and was able to document that you need to be very careful with the statistical analysis because if you do the analysis wrong, you're artificially inflating the performance of the group. And when you do it the way she proposed, you can show that more often than not, the group is not doing as well as the individuals when you aggregate the individual's performance. But these are just some samplings of essentially a century's worth of research. But I want to fast forward to the 1990s when cognition and the study of groups and teams really took off. And I think if you place this in the larger context of the cognitive revolution, so cognitive psychology, my home discipline, it was really having a big impact on other areas of psychology. So social psychologists, organizational psychologists started to pay attention to this. And it was this notion of information processing was very dominant at this time. So the computer revolution was taking place. And what's important to recognize there from a historical standpoint is whenever you look at how humans think about the brain, they always compare it to whatever is the current technology that we have in our society. So if you look at the thinking about the brain during the industrial evolution, it's cogs and wheels, so the mechanized machine. If you look at it earlier in the 21st century, it was like the Bell telephone switching stations where the Bell operators were connecting different people to make phone calls, and then along comes the computer. Hey, the brain's like a computer, and it processes information. There's input, there's output, and that analogy is important because the view of the brain as a computer became dominant, and they stopped thinking about it as an analogy and an actual realistic way to understand cognition. I won't get into what happened in philosophy and cognitive science because there was a lot of debate about that. And fortunately, people started to recognize that the brain is not like a computer. There's really the body is playing a role, the environment is playing a role. So there's what we call 4E cognition, embodied and active, extended and appended cognition, which, to say it succinctly, they're trying to do away with the information processing view of cognition and recognize cognition as a larger whole. And that's relevant to this because these areas of research on this slide here, the 1990s, it was still dominated by this information processing view of cognition. So in educational psychology, social psychology, so John Levine and Lauren Resnick, they got together and they talked about this idea of socially shared cognition. So John Levine was a social psychologist, Lauren Resnick was an education policy person, but they were recognizing the value of thinking about cognition at the inter and intra-individual level. And Larson and Christensen, they wrote a paper out in British Journal of Psychology in 1993, talking about social processes, but here you see very much information processing terminology, acquisition, storage, transmission, manipulation, and use of information for a group-level intellective product. So leading towards what we now call collective intelligence. And then probably one of the most famous studies is Hinz, Tyndall, and Walrath, published in Psychological Bulletin in 1997. The title was Groups as Information Processors. So that really cemented the idea of thinking about cognition in the context of groups. So encoding, storage, retrieval, all these computer metaphors were now being applied to groups and teams. And a bit of historical trivia there. This paper, published in 1993, was in a special issue of the British Journal of Psychology, and it was about ideas related to cognition. Hinz and colleagues submitted to that journal. They were rejected because Larson had already been accepted. They had basically overlapping ideas, and they said, well, we're not going to have two papers on this kind of cognition view in groups. So they accepted Larson, and Hinz, they went on and they tried to submit it to another journal, and like a social psychology journal got rejected because social psychologists didn't like to think that way, and they kept submitting, and it kept getting rejected. And they ended up submitting it to Psychological Bulletin. They had done so much work on it. And if you're not familiar with the psychology journal hierarchy, Psych Bulletin is like one of the top journals in psychology. They submitted it in Psych Bulletin. It got accepted, and it's been cited thousands of times. It's one of the most influential papers in this area. And it was just interesting because no one knows Larson and Christensen. Larson and Christensen got the ideas before they did, in 93 compared to 97. But no one remembers Larson and Christensen. Everyone remembers Hinz et al. With this idea of groups as information processing. So a bit of historical trivia about when and where you get published can often have an impact on the impact of those ideas. But similar around that time, organizational psychologists and organizational scientists began to pay attention to this. So shared mental models was an idea that came out of industrial organizational psychology, where they essentially appropriated the mental model idea from cognitive psychology, and they said, hey, we think that there's not simply mental models in teams, but there's shared mental models, where that helps them coordinate. And then teamwork schema similarity came along. Around that time, had very similar ideas, appropriating language from schema theory about assimilation and using that for sense making, and then transactive memory system, based upon the work of Dan Wagner and his studies of couples. So all of these were also influential ideas where you can see mental models, schemas. They're paying attention to cognition, but now they're applying these ideas to groups and teams. But then there's what I refer to as this external cognition turn, because all of those ideas were really focusing more on what's going on inside the head and how you can think about what's going on inside the head of team members and try to extrapolate that from some kind of group cognition. But outside of psychology and the org sciences, there were groups of people who were looking at this phenomena, but coming at it from their own disciplinary perspectives. So Jean Lave came up with the idea of situated cognition. So she was taking more of an anthropological approach, wrote the book Cognition in Practice. One of the more influential ones, Ed Hutchins, wrote Cognition in the Wild. So he was looking at complex collaborative processes and came up with this idea of a kind of distributed cognition. And in the research scholarly area of communication, which is a very large, very rich, very robust area of scholarship, they have a sub-area on groups and teams, and they too had been looking at group cognition, not calling it group cognition, but still having a lot of influence because they're paying attention specifically to verbal and nonverbal communication and producing a lot of influential ideas. And then in computer-supported collaborative work, they labeled this group cognition instead of team cognition, but in this they were talking about cognition as arising from not simply what's inside the head, but how they're working with material objects in the world. So again, the external cognition turn was also happening around this time outside of psychology. And then In the early 2000s, I got out of graduate school and I went down to the University of Central Florida and was able to work with some of the people, Ed Salas, who started this idea of shared mental models. And we put together this edited volume, Team Cognition, in 2004. And this was really an interdisciplinary volume. We really wanted to make it interdisciplinary because there were so many different people talking about this idea of cognition outside the individual level. And there were actually 2 chapters in here by computer scientists. So back then, there were not a lot of computer scientists paying attention to teamwork. Katia Sakara at Carnegie Mellon, we invited her to write a chapter because she was doing a really nice job thinking about teamwork and trying to apply that to robotics. Saul Greenberg at Calgary University, he was doing pioneering work in computer-supported collaborative workstations and wrote a very nice chapter for this book. So the idea, again, was to bring together these different perspectives on team cognition and put out this volume where someone could have it as a resource and potentially as something like a graduate school textbook. And we also published one a few years later, again, looking at how the field had changed over the years. But the big picture question when we talk about team cognition is we're really looking at not simply the collective cognition, but we're looking at the attitudes and the behaviors and the intermingling of all of these group dynamics kinds of processes and how they influence cognition at the individual level. But really the overarching epistemological issue here is how does team cognition lead to coordination? When you're bringing people together, invariably they need to have some kind of coordinated activity that produces a meaningful output. So across all of these different perspectives, when you look at it at this higher level of abstraction, is how does cognition in a team lead to team coordination? So with that kind of whirlwind, I want to get more narrow into a specific area of research we call macrocognition. So we're academics, we have to invent words. Macrocognition is an invented term specifically created to juxtapose it with microcognition. Shocking. Microcognition was the way that this community was essentially being dismissive of cognitive psychology. So these were people who were studying cognition in the real world, and studying puzzles, studying those kinds of things and lists of words, that's not going to help us understand cognition in the real world. We need to look at cognition as it happens in natural systems, and they came up with this idea of macrocognition as a way to brand a new area. And so some of these people are good friends of mine, and we had lots of hearty debates because I was one of those puzzle cognitive psychologists, and I thought I knew a lot about cognition by looking at how people solve puzzles, but they disagreed. And they came up with this theoretical framework referred to again as macrocognition or the macrocognitive approach. So you can see some of the features they're talking about. It is not just natural, but also artificial cognitive systems, this idea of it being distributed. It's not a finite activity, but it's a continuance of activity. It is embedded within particular environments, and artifacts aid in nearly every facet of this cognition. So they were trying to represent and try to identify what are the things we need to pay attention to if we truly want to understand cognition in the real world in these kinds of complex environments. So this has influenced my colleagues and I, the way we think about team cognition in general, but also how we have been thinking about collaborative problem solving, which now will take me to macrocognition in teams. So being very inventive, we just took macrocognition and added teams to it. So just like team cognition, added teams to cognition. We were very creative ourselves, and now we call it macrocognition in teams. So we published this book back in 2008 where we wanted to bring together a group of researchers who were looking at cognition in the real world. So we branded this idea of macrocognition in teams, and we talked about it as being this interdisciplinary approach where we wanted to bring together different fields. So we defined it as this process of transforming internalized team knowledge into externalized team knowledge via individual and team knowledge building processes. So it's collaboratively mediated, so it occurs within and across individuals. Artifacts are going to influence, and cognition is emergent in this environment. So we tried to be specific with what we were thinking about when it came to cognition in groups. So we talked about it's both inside the head, it's both outside the head. It could be verbalization when we talk about externalization. It could be the artifacts, the things in the environment associated with the collaborative cognition. All of these are the kinds of factors that we wanted to pay attention to. So our initial thinking, we published this kind of conceptual piece about what we considered macrocognition in teams, and we wanted to move towards a theory here. And this was a graphic I put together, and I'm not a graphic artist, so forgive the sloppiness of it. This was my attempt to kind of represent what we were thinking about with macrocognition in teams. So I'll unpack it here, since it's not really obvious. You have these 4 little circles in the upper left-hand quadrant. These circles are actually arrows. That's meant to represent 4 individuals in a team. The arrows represent their thinking. So here you have a 4-member team. They're sitting around thinking about their problem, and then they cycle to a group level activity. So here this large circle is meant to represent the groups interacting. So they're no longer just individuals thinking, they're now at a group, they're discussing what they know about the idea or about the problem they're approaching. And then it cycles back to individuals. So what did they hear at the group level? Now that's influencing how they're thinking at the individual level. And it repeats this process of individual to team or group level cognition. And this in the center, this D to I to K. Part of the model we talk about it has to do with how do you take data, turn it into information, and how do you turn information into knowledge? A big part, as I mentioned, is knowledge building. Because we're studying problem solving, we focus very much on what it means to build knowledge or what it means to build new knowledge, because by definition, when you're solving a problem, more often than not, you need to create the knowledge. What makes problem solving is there is a gap in your understanding of some phenomena, so you have to build, integrate, synthesize what is existing knowledge and build new knowledge in order to solve that problem. So what this graphic is meant to represent is this kind of interdependent processes of moving from the individual to the group level. These are nested processes because we recognize that you have groups embedded within teams, and they're going to be having this reciprocal influence on each other. So again, this was the first attempt to try to capture what we meant by macrocognition in teams. And then we published a paper in 2010 more formally describing this. And this is the representation that we've been using since then, where we have these macrocognitive functions that we're talking about. And in this diagram, you can see that we're taking into account this multi-level phenomena. So it's still about the individual and the team and the interaction therein. It's also about the internalization and externalization of cognition. So paying very much attention to the externalization processes, whether it be through specific verbalizations or whether it be through the creation of artifacts that are facilitating that. And we also talk about the temporal characteristics of problem solving, noting that there are phases that groups go through as they work to try to solve a problem. So all of this was articulated in this theoretical paper published back in 2010. We had a twin paper to that, though, published at the same time, where we talked about the framework, this macrocognition in teams, but we identified a bunch of different measures associated with each one of these, and we identified the kinds of indices that you could look at if you wanted to study this phenomena. So this is just one of the tables of many that are in this article, where we're talking about measurement methods, indices, and examples of individual knowledge building. So if you remember, individual knowledge building was one of the processes here, so we had tables associated with every one of these. We lay out notional ideas of what you could do to measure these. So within each one of these major factors, we have sub-macrocognitive processes. So part of individual knowledge building is individual information gathering, knowledge object development. So these are labels we came up with to describe what are the processes people go to as they build their own knowledge. And we had associated with it the kinds of measures that one could use if they wanted to study it. So knowledge object development, you need to pay attention to the notes that they're creating, the diagrams, the tables, the sketches, all the kinds of things that people use when they think outside the head. They think on the paper, they think on the whiteboard. These are the kinds of things we talk about with knowledge object development. And again, the point of this paper was to not just publish a theory, but publish a way for people to do their own studies and give them indications of how they could measure these phenomena that we thought were of interest. So with regard to the actual empirical work, one of the early studies we did was actually for NASA. And this was a study of a particular problem-solving episode that they had, the main bus switching unit. And because I like giving some of the history here, this is a lesson for graduate students to follow up and to have conversations. So I was at a dinner at a workshop once and sitting next to someone I didn't know. And it was the usual, oh, what do you do? You know, and this person was working for Johnson Space Center. He was one of the lead engineers at Mission Control in Johnson Space Center. And he was, one of his jobs was building the training programs for Mission Control at Johnson Space Center. So he's talking about the kinds of things that he does. I said, oh, I'm kind of interested in that. We look at kind of complex problem solving, collaborative problem solving. We talked about what we do. Key is I followed up. I sent him the papers we had published. So that's always networking rule number one. You meet somebody, you send an email afterwards, thanks, nice to meet you. I enjoyed the talk, send him some papers. Didn't think anything of it. A couple years later, get an email from him. He says, you know, I've got a problem I think you guys can help with. So it turns out that they had addressed a problem on the space station, the main bus switching unit problem. And because his job is training, what they do is they actually do these kind of after-action processes where they interview the people involved in the collaborative problem solving. They try to elicit from them the processes in which they engage. And he said, I don't know how to make sense of what we have from these interviews. I think maybe your macrocognition in teams model might help us make sense of it. So basically they hired us to code the interview transcripts according to the macrocognition in teams model. So like, sure, this is great. It would be a lot of fun to work with experts in the real world. And what we did is we just looked at it from the perspective through the lens of the macrocognition and teams model, said, well, here they're talking about building knowledge, here they're talking about externalization of knowledge, and we gave them kind of a descriptive analysis to help them then try to build training where they're taking these very low-level data points from the interviews and abstracting them to higher-level categories that they could then use in the training. So it was a fun project, and it got us to show the real-world validity, so to speak, of the macrocognition and teams model. But I also like putting this out there because a fun part of the problem solving, it made it to a publication in the magazine The Atlantic. And as they were trying to fix this piece of electrical equipment, it turns out that they had to fix an associated piece of electronics that was very sensitive, and they had to come up with a way to fix it because it was so sensitive. They ended up using the plastic bristles from a toothbrush. So this is the space station. They can't just go to the store and buy stuff. They had to come up with the creative way to address one of the problems. So the title, clickbait, behold the toothbrush that just saved the International Space Station, because it was a really serious problem. They could have lost power to the space station if they didn't fix it. Because of that, they also brought us back, this time before they did the interviews. There was another big problem on the space station. There was an ammonia leak, and they said, we want to interview them again because what we just did was phenomenal. So they, in a matter of 36 hours from when they discovered the problem, they had brought the problem-solving teams together, came up with a solution, and executed the EVA, the extravehicular activity, in order to fix that problem within 36 hours. So just mind-blowing. And again, one of the chief engineers, they approached us and they said, okay, we're going to interview people again, but now help us write the interview questions. Because before they had already done the interviews, so we wrote the interview questions based upon now more of the macrocognition and teams model to try to elicit what we thought were the important processes. And we did this because, again, they're trying to develop training for it, and we thought it would be a good exercise for us and for the students. And this one we haven't published, but I wanted to share it because they were interested in training. I was playing around with the idea of narrative and storytelling as a method for training. So what we did is hired a screenwriter, a graduate student at the university who was actually a screenwriter and was getting his degree in English. And we wrote a screenplay about this problem-solving incident. And the idea that we were pitching to them is when actors are about to put on a performance, one of the first things they do is the table read. And the table read is where you're sitting around, you have the screenplay in front of you, and you have to understand the characters, you have to understand the situation. And we wrote the screenplay according to the macrocognition and teams model, but it was very high fidelity from the standpoint of the transcripts, and it's what you call creative nonfiction. So it was a real event, but we got creative with it and wrote the screenplay about it. So it was just a fun way to think across disciplines as a potential training method. NASA's pretty conservative. They weren't ready to do a screenplay for their training, but it was just a fun example of the kinds of things that you can do when you work with people from other disciplines. So as another example of the empirical data with the macrocognition in teams. This is the dissertation of one of my students, Travis Wiltshire. So he did not quite microcognition, not quite macrocognition, somewhere in between. It was a computer simulated problem solving game called Moonbase Alpha, where you're operating at this moon base. There's an asteroid strike. You have to fix the damaged equipment or they're going to lose oxygen. So you have to work with other team members. You have to work with robotics in order to figure out how to solve the problem. So it's a nice little macro cognitive synthetic test bed where you can study more complex cognitive processes. So he used this for his dissertation. But Travis was a really smart guy, and he wanted to understand the part of the model associated with phase transitions. So we had used that language in the macrocognitive model to talk about how they move along the problem-solving processes from initial problem definition, building their model of the problem space, generating solutions, evaluating those solutions, and we had all the macrocognitive terminology associated with it. So what he did was code the communications. But the key he did was he developed what he called the sliding window entropy technique. So he used this idea of entropy in order to diagnose these phase transitions in the problem solving and was able to document that when they shifted from one phase to another, the communications, there were more entropy in those communications. That is, we're talking about similar things based upon the coding and the communications, similar things within the macrocognition and teams model, and then it gets all discombobulated, and then boom, they're in a new phase. So he was able to use this method of analysis to predict these transitions to these macrocognitive phases, and was able to show that when you have lower entropy at these phase transitions, those teams are actually doing better. So even though there is some entropy as they switch from phase to phase, when they were more effective in their problem solving, there was lower entropy at these phase transitions. So a nice example of a methodological take on the model. But again, Travis, really smart guy. He wanted to dig a little bit more deeply into it. And this was interesting because he also collected video for his dissertation. So he had students working on this computer-based problem solving. They're facing each other, looking at each other, but they're also working on their monitors. And they had a video camera videotaping them and monitoring their movement. And this gets back to what I was describing earlier as embodied cognition and enactive cognition, because part of the research we're trying to do is understand the relationship between body movements and interactions. And he actually was able to diagnose synchrony in body movements using the video, and he called this coherence in their movement, and was able to diagnose good from poor problem solving, looking at the coherence or the synchrony in the body movements. And this is really just what we call a butts in seats kind of problem solving. You know, you're just sitting there, you're working on your computer simulation, they're not working with a whiteboard, they're not moving around a room, but still there was enough subtle movement that was detectable with this frame differencing that he did using the video, breaking that down and showing the similarity and the synchrony or the coherence in their movement, and was able to show how this coherence and movement was predictive of good problem solving. So the teams that were best at the problem solving, they had high coherence throughout their entire problem solving. The ones that were bad at the problem solving, you see this U-shaped curve where they move from high to low coherence. So they're much less stable in their body movement interactions. And I'm not going to try to unpack, but I think he was taking a visualization course at this time and wanted to publish some of the fun visualizations that he did. And this is a representation of coherence where he was actually documenting, in this case, this is a visualization of a low-performing team and a high-performing team. And you can see there's not much red areas, and the red is the mapping of the coherence down here. You see much more coherence associated with these areas of their problem solving as they move through time. So the better team, he was able to visualize the coherence. And argument there is if you want a real-time way to look at this phenomena we're calling coherence, this is a potential way to visualize that technique. So the idea we're publishing from an applied standpoint is if you're going to build a dashboard to monitor team effectiveness, there's many ways you can visualize it. So that was the idea with this pretty sophisticated visualization technique. Another one of my students, she was interested in teamwork, but she was interested in software teams. And what she did was look at GitHub and looked at GitHub productivity. And if you're familiar with GitHub, there's these thousands of repos out there. These repos are essentially a bunch of teams working on solving software problems. So what she did was extracted thousands and thousands of data points from the GitHub repository. And let's see, this was published in 2022, but the GitHub repo data was probably from around 2015, 2016 or so. And I'm contextualizing that because she studied bots on GitHub, but these were bots from around 2015, 2016. Nowhere near the large language models, nowhere near ChatGPT or what we see now with the current AI methods. So I wanted to qualify that with, these were bots, these were AI of a sort, but they're not nearly as sophisticated as we have currently. With that said, though, she was able to diagnose differences based upon the coding of the kind of work activity that they were doing. So another factor that she took into account was the size of the teams. And in this case, it's the size of the repos. So some of the repos have small numbers of teams, like 5 to 10 people, and you have very large repos with hundreds of team members. So that was one of the ways that she differentiated them. And then she compared repos, not simply by size, but whether or not they had bots working with them on the team. And the question we are interested in is, how do bots, as a member of a team, alter productivity, alter collaborative processes? And so I just have a snapshot of a couple of the findings here. Looking at team productivity, and one of the key things to clearly understand is this is just looking at the humans and the work that they do. So you can classify the kind of work like push and pulls on the repos, and you can classify the human activity. So just analyzing the productivity of the humans on that team was able to show that bots on a team made humans more productive. And that qualifier is important because we know bots can get a lot of shit done. But we didn't look at what the bots were doing, we were looking at what the humans were doing. So when you compare the humans in the bot team to the humans in the no bot teams, the humans on the bot team were more productive. Another thing, though, of interest to her was this notion of centralization or distribution of work. So she's interested in these ideas about how open source software is a much more collaborative environment. She wanted to see the degree to which you could look at different forms of collaboration in these repos. So she used what's called the Gini coefficient, which is coming out from economics, and it's initially a method of disparity in incomes in different countries, but it's been adapted for other areas. She looked at it for a disparity in workload across these repos. So what this metric means is when the Gini coefficient reaches 1, the work is more unevenly distributed. So it's centralized to a small number of people. And what she was able to show that with the bots on a team, it produces greater disparity. There's more work centralization. So for whatever reason, and this is an important qualifier here, we don't know why. All we can tell you is what was happening. So this is one of the limiting factors of this kind of research. We're not out there talking to the people. You know, this is the big data kind of studies where you're just pulling data from the internet. And I qualify it because I'm a psychologist, you know, and social scientist, and normally we want to talk to the people. We want to know what's going on with those people. We don't know what's going on with those people. We only have representations of their activity. So in looking at that activity, not only did we show differences in productivity, but she was able to document this differences in centralization of work. So the people on the bots team, for whatever reason, there was more concentration in the labor that's distributed across those teams. So a nice way to show the early effects of how bots were influencing human work. So that's some of the empirical results that we've done. And again, I wanted to point out the dissertations. So initial work done by Mike Rosen and then Travis Wiltshire. These matter because that highfalutin model we came up with never would have been realized if these students didn't do their dissertation associated with it. So they had to take these concepts we had, they had to communicate or analyze their communication protocols and actually come up with coding schemes to move from these high-level abstractions to these lower-level parsed verbal units and relate them to these macrocognitive processes. And because of that, we have these very sophisticated code books that have been developing and evolving over the years. So Mike Rosen did it first, Travis Wiltshire worked with those, evolved it, Olivia Newton, she worked with hers and evolved it as well. And because these are out there and available, another thing I wanted to point to, what's most exciting is other people have picked up the model. So this is just snapshots of other people, not affiliated with us, but other researchers who have been adopting the macrocognition in teams model because we are so specific about these processes, and we were able to help them identify how do you measure these things. So initially it was picked up by people in our Department of Defense, so Susan Hutchin, Naval Postgraduate School, James or Chris Baber at the UK was looking at to study situation awareness in command and control type teams. But it was also picked up by people in medical research, so looking at macrocognition in intensive care units, people looking at design teams, people in education research trying to come up with ways to code collaborative problem solving. And surprisingly, someone used it to talk about collective leadership. That one just came out in 2024, so I have not read that yet. I was kind of intrigued by it. In business, in colleges of business, people have used it to study MBA team problem solving, and they actually developed a software that they call COPRA to model and to actually extract and code collaboration processes and use the macrocognition in Teams code as a way to extract the communications that are happening. And this one, hot off the press, I just found this. They're using it to try to think about lunar construction. So they've identified it as a way to, when we build our lunar bases, can we use this as a way to understand complex construction scenarios? So again, an example that you put these ideas out there, you give a lot of guidance, because too often these theories are put out there and the work comes in translating those theories into something that you can operationalize and that you can code. And because we were able to do that, other people have picked it up, and it's nice to see that it's having that kind of impact. This is another one I just found out about, actually when I was preparing for some recent work. This is only up on Archive, but what really attracted me is they built a software system to facilitate this kind of collaborative real-time problem solving. And it's again, based upon the macrocognition in teams model, and I didn't talk about this idea of offloading and scaffolding, but that's a big part of the model coming out of cognitive science. When we discuss this idea of external cognition or extended cognition, these concepts of offloading and scaffolding are crucial to what we talk about. They're crucial because humans are limited in their ability to remember things. We have a very limited working memory. When you're working on complex problems, your working memory is going to be filled up very rapidly. And what we do to account for that is we start writing stuff down. You know, we offload this information either to a notebook, but when you're working in a group or a team, you offload it into the whiteboard. And if you just think about any kind of team project you've been working on in a meeting room, for example, invariably someone's going to hop up and go to the whiteboard and start jotting down the ideas that people are having. So this is the process we call offloading. You're taking what would be normally something remembered in your head, in memory, but you're putting it out there in the world. And it's there for everybody to see. The other process, though, is called scaffolding. And this is where you take these offloaded, what we call cognitive artifacts, and you start manipulating them. And what I mean by manipulating, so imagine you had a list of bulleted items, or you just, oh, we talked about this, we talked about this, we talked about this. You've got a bunch of bulleted items out there, and as you discuss it more, you realize some kind of thematic relationship, some way to categorize these things. So you start making categories, you start drawing boxes around those ideas, you start drawing arrows between those boxes, so that we refer to that as scaffolding, because the cognitive artifact is actually part of your cognition. And it's now mediating the cognition between each other on that team. And we're saying that this is part of this distributed cognition, and we call this scaffolding because it is supporting the cognitive and collaborative processes. So that's the theoretical component. So what these computer scientists did is they built this software system in order to facilitate the offloading and scaffolding, and they have AI, ChatGPT running underneath it. And like I said, I just found out about this a couple weeks ago, and I emailed them and I said, can I play with it? So we've got some students working on trying to download it. And rest assured, I've got ideas for lots of experiments if we can get this kind of thing working. But a good example of how technology can be built based upon grounded theory, and how now we can test that technology to see if it's actually facilitating things. So, is it really already 5 o'clock? I've missed the time. Okay, I'm gonna skip this stuff and hop to the artificial social intelligence, because I have till 5:15, right? Is that correct? You said an hour, Jonas? Yeah. Okay. All right, so fast forward. Because we had been doing so much work in teams, we wanted to now think about how artificial intelligence is affecting collaboration. We had a project funded by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the Department of Defense of the United States, and they too were interested in teaming, but they wanted to look not at how AI could be a tool, they wanted to look at how AI could be a member of a team. So that with this kind of idea as being a real member of a team and not simply a technology that you use, they put together a bunch of funded proposals, and we had to work as this team of teams to try to address this problem. So we had psychologists, organizational behavior researchers, computer scientists, all working on these different teams, but all trying to work together to build this artificial intelligence. One of the key distinctions that we make in this literature is the distinction between teamwork and task work. So this is an old idea that comes out of training research, and what matters here is task work is the stuff you need to do on a team. It's the goals, the objectives, and when we talk about training for task work, if you're familiar with this term KSAs, you talk about the knowledge you need to get your task done, the skills you need to get your task done, the attitude you need to have to get your job done. So that differentiation is important because we juxtapose it with teamwork. So teamwork is how you get the task done. Teamwork involves things like communication. Teamwork involves things like sharing leadership. Teamwork involves things like backup behavior, and teamwork involves cohesion, how well you're working as a team. This is the stuff of team research. So what we study in team research are these kinds of group dynamics processes that facilitate getting the work done. This difference matters because we wanted to build AI that could do teamwork. We didn't care about AI that could do task work. We know AI is very good at getting things done. AI is very good at solving kind of problems. AI can't work with people. It needs the interpersonal capabilities in order to effectively work with people. So this was one of the stepping off points for our research here is the difference between teamwork and task work. But we took it a step further because when we study teams and we're trying to understand how well they do, how effective they are as a team, we also try to understand what are the generic or general kind of skills or competencies that they have compared to the specific things they need to get done. So the generic kinds of competencies are the things that you, as someone who operates on a team, you can take those competencies with you no matter what kind of team you're on. So are you an active listener? Do you know how to handle conflict? Those are what we call general kinds of competencies that are transportable to different kinds of team contexts. We contrast that with specific competencies, and again, this is the stuff of training research, because in training research, when it comes to teams, we try to differentiate these specific from general competencies and build training programs around that. I'm explaining it in this context because this creates this nice 2x2, where you have general and specific task competencies and general and specific team competencies, but what we wanted to focus on was, can you build AI that would fit in this bottom right-hand quadrant? Can you make AI that can have these kinds of generalizable competencies that enable it to work as a human or work with human members of a team? So that was the stepping off point for this research project. And the way we did it, this was a very large research project, we were one team of many, is we looked at how well they could work on tasks and how well they could work, they being humans. So we created what we call player profiles, where players are members of the team. And prior to any work on the test bed that I'll talk about in a moment, what we did is we had a set of surveys, because we're grounded social scientists, that's what we love, surveys. We give people surveys, we collect data about them. We had sets of surveys that assessed their task competence, and we had sets of surveys that assessed their team competence. But these were generic kinds of competencies. So what we wanted to do in the case of a game environment was identify sets of competencies that were related to the task but transportable to other kinds of tasks. So we used the Santa Barbara sense of direction. So if you're familiar with spatial kind of environment research, this measure came out as a validated measure of sense of direction, is able to predict how well people are at wayfinding kinds of activities. And because these kinds of testbed environments often involve finding your way in virtual worlds, we thought this would be important for the task. We also had a measure of video game experience. How much do you play games? What kind of games do you play? And then we had what we referred to as a competency test. Basically, can you run? Can you jump? Do you know how to do basic kinds of maneuvers in video game environments? So we had them execute those as well. Then the one that matters, though, is the so that's an example of the task competencies. The one that matters are the team competencies. Again, we wanted generalized team competencies. That is, it doesn't matter what kind of team you're on. If you have these, you have high potential to work well in a team. One of the ones we did was reading the mind and the eyes. If you're not familiar with this is an area of research out of social cognition. It's essentially assessing the degree to which you can make mental state attributions about other people. It's been used a lot in autism research, but also in just general developmental research to see the degree to which people have good theory of mind. So that was one of the measures. We also had a measure of sociable dominance. So another validated measure that predicts social interactions, how you behave when you're around other people. And then we had a measure of psychological collectivism. Do you like being around others? Do you like working with others? So these were the generic competencies we assessed to determine the potential of their ability to work on a team. So this is the reading the mind and the eyes test. So you look at these eyes and you make assessments of what you think these people are thinking. Psychological collectivism. I care more about my goals than those groups, And so this person is high in collectivism. I have no problems talking in front of a group. This person is high in sociable dominance. So again, the idea was the degree to which these more generic competencies would be related to in-game behavior. We did this, though, because we wanted to feed the AI this kind of information. Because they're building the AI that has to understand a team, and because we know humans that work with each other on teams acquire this kind of knowledge, so just reflect on your own teams. You could probably identify teammates you've worked with that are pretty socially dominant or people who are collectively oriented. We know that human teams acquire that kind of assessment of their teammates all of the time. So our goal was to collect this data, quantify it in such a way that we could provide a profile to the AI that it could then use to facilitate how that AI interacted with members of a team. So getting back to the 2x2, we had these surveys, we quantified the teams such that they fell into one of these quadrants. So the team was either made up of people primarily low in task work and low in teamwork, and then we had teams that were made up of people high in task work and high in teamwork, and then you had these off diagonals. So we're able to classify the degree to which these people had the kind of competence that was important for the task and the kind of competence that was important for the team. And at this point, you can think about this related to intelligence, because these kinds of competencies are a form of team intelligence. If you are good at these kinds of things, you should be more effective as a member of a team. You should be better at collaboration processes, but again, at a very generic or generalizable level. So we had the profiling technique, we got these surveys, and then we had the people play the game. So in the interest of time, I'll just quickly run through this. This is all open source. You can find this in the Open Science Framework, the testbed itself, the initial studies that we ran, and the data are all available for people who are interested in this. One of the testbeds that was developed out of this project, and it was developed by Arizona State University, is this large collaborative, was referred to as gamified urban search and rescue. So remember this idea of microcognition versus macrocognition? We're trying to create complex synthetic environments that undergraduates, can sit down and engage in cognitive and coordinative behavior. But we wanted to do more than just give them puzzles and simple kinds of tasks. We wanted to give them difficult tasks in which they need to execute sets of cognitive and coordinative behaviors in a more ecologically valid environment. And what's more ecologically valid than Minecraft? No, but Minecraft, we use Minecraft because everybody knows it and it's very easy to modify. So they created a search and rescue environment in Minecraft. And let's see. In the task, in the search and rescue, the team members played different roles. They were a medic, they were an engineer, they were a transporter. And I'm not going to get too much into the weeds, but it was built such that there were interdependencies to function as a team where in the search and rescue task, there was a building, there was a collapse of that building, so there were victims that they had to go in and they had to rescue those victims. Some were critically injured, some were only minor injuries, but the medic had to work with the engineer because the building was collapsed. The engineer had to move rubble around, and then the medic had to work with the transporter to get victims out of there. So we tried to build in the kinds of interdependencies that are crucial to teamwork. That is, in order to do well, you had to work together. Not work alone, you had to work together. The key goals were you had to locate, you had to triage, and you had to move the victims. And there are some other components, but what I wanted to provide was first. This is just a demo video that Reese Bendel, one of the lead students working on this project, made for us. And it's at the top, it's representing the medic and an engineer working over here collaboratively to engage in the rescue. And over here, the lone medic is reaching victims by itself. So this is, in the situation, the medic could work by itself sometimes, and the engineer and the medic and engineer had to work collaboratively in order to solve the problem. So he was illustrating this kind of collaborative behavior over here. But at the bottom, what he wanted to illustrate was how the closeness, the proximity of the team was sometimes problematic. So here you've got the medic, the engineer, and the searcher all grouped up and disrupting their flow. So they were not really coordinating their behaviors because in this situation they were not supposed to be together. They were supposed to be, some were supposed to be out there exploring, trying to find victims, where once a victim was found, then they should be triaged. So that was just meant to demonstrate what was going on. And then here is gameplay.
I'm going to clear the, oh yeah, you guys are slow. Slow pose. So yeah, I'm going to clear westernmost side first and then zigzag towards east. Can somebody clear my, oh, right, that wasn't the right spot. Yeah, somebody just clear the rubble here on the little left side. Are we all different colors? No, okay, you guys are just color coded by what we're wearing. Or rather color coded by what we're using. Sorry, you just started hitting me? Okay. Player collision is the thing, got it.
So those are the victims down in the bottom. And because it's Minecraft, as I used to joke, you have to beat the victims to life. So the way you triage and help them is you hit them with the medic's tool. But this is, you just see the three different screens. You see one of the players here engaged in the gameplay, and this is a visual representation of what the different players are seeing. So they're operating in this virtual environment, going through, trying to search this space. And as you can see, they had a little bit of a dashboard associated with that space. And not only did we build in the interdependencies, we also built in kind of this external cognition idea, the extended cognition. And we built that in because as they were going through and exploring, they could leave a cue and said, hey, we found a victim here. So they could put some kind of signage out and say not only what kind of, what victim was where, but what kind of victim. So the way to put the cognition out there in the real world, so instead of just using verbalization and saying, hey, there's a victim in quadrant such and such, room number here, they could put it out there in the world and leave it to offload that kind of information in such a way that it would facilitate the coordination, because you don't have to remember it now, you've offloaded it into the environment. So that was another part of the test bed that we built into it. So let's move ahead. The first, just to show the relationship between these team profiles and their actual performance. Kind of hard to unpack here, but these are the teams that were high in team potential and high in task potential. So remember, before they did anything, they had to fill out our silly surveys, and we were able to quantify them into these quadrants, the 2x2. So in the upper left here, you see the teams that were classified as having high potential in both teamwork and task work. Down here, you have the teams that were classified ahead of time as low teamwork and low task work. Remember, just generic collaborative tendencies, not the actual game. And we were able to document that, look, the ones who did worse were the ones who we expected to do worse. They had poor collaborative competencies, they had poor teamwork or task work kinds of competencies. The ones we expected to do best did best. The interesting thing here is this one is we predicted high teamwork competence, but also low task work competence. Meaning on our measures of kind of generic tasks, these people we put in the low, high teamwork but low task work. I'm pointing that out because you see they did just as well. And one way to interpret this is teamwork competencies are just as important as task work competencies. So your ability to function as a team essentially is able to compensate for poor task competence. So if you're a good team member, you can substitute that for being crappy at working in this Minecraft environment. Now, what happens when you add ASI to the mix? I should add that we had not only artificial intelligence playing on the team, but we also had humans, and I forgot to mention a key factor here. The AI was acting as a coach or a facilitator. So that was one of the key things that we made here is we wanted AI not to work in the team. We wanted the AI to observe the team, make recommendations to the team on how to function more effectively as a team. So we referred to this as team coaching, and the computer scientists built this architecture in such a way that the AI monitored the collaboration, could not comment on improving the task. The AI wasn't saying or helping them do the actual search and rescue. It was making recommendations on how to help the team get better at search and rescue. So in the study, we had 3 primary conditions. One where there was no coach or advisor, one where there was a human coach or advisor, and then another where there was ASI, the artificial social intelligence. So this is just looking at the teams that we predicted as low in teamwork potential and low in task work potential compared to the teams that were high in task work and teamwork potential. So the 2 parts of that 2x2 diagonal, the ones that we predicted would do the best and the ones we predicted would do the worst. What you see here is that the high task, high team potential, the solid circles, when they don't have a coach, they do great. When they have a human coach, they still do well. What you see here is when the low teams, that is the ones who we said they're going to suck because they have poor collaborative and task potential, they did do poorly. They benefited some when they had the human advisor. They benefited more when they had the AI advisor. But here's the interesting part. The human teams that were very good going into it, when you give them the ASI coach, they tanked. They started to suck. So you see that this is the teams that were predicted to do best. You give them an ASI and their performance goes down. So essentially, it helps the teams that are going to be poorly, or that we predict to do poorly. The ASI is helping those teams, but hurting the ones that we would have predicted to do well. So that was a nice interaction. And then we wanted to dig deeper into some of the game mechanics. So I mentioned the externalizations. This is where they're putting cognitive artifacts in the environment. This is an indication of coordination. So you see the high team potential are doing well here. They're leaving lots of cognitive artifacts, that is, a lot of cues out in the environment to facilitate coordination. And they're also doing a little bit more poorly when they have the ASI. But the key part here is, again, the very poor predicted teams, the teams that have low competence, low potential in teamwork and task work. They sucked when they didn't have any coaching. They went way up when they had a human coach, and they were about the same when they had an ASI. And this distinction between a human and AI is important because if you can build AI that can act like a human, you can have lots of human coaches. You don't have to worry about training human coaches. So this was an important finding just to show that the AI was in some degree working as good as a human advisor in this environment. And I should add, this paper just came out in Scientific Reports where you can read more about it. Another coordination measure we had, we referred to this as risk management. Because this is Minecraft, and we wanted to penalize poor team behavior, We used freezing. In Minecraft, you can freeze people in the environment. So that was like being injured. You would get frozen in the Minecraft environment. And you get frozen when you're doing poorly because you go into the wrong room and there's something there that freezes you. And if you're working and functioning effectively as a team, you will let each other know, hey, don't go in that room. I just saw something in there. You're going to get frozen. And what you see here, higher numbers are bad. The low task, low team, they spent a lot of time frozen compared to the high task, high team. Not as much time frozen. This is when there is no advisor. And then when they have a human advisor, they both do better, much more so for the low team, low task potential. And again, with the ASI advisor, roughly the same. So the punchline here is that if you have a team that has low potential in teamwork and task work, you give them a coach, give them a facilitator, whether it's a human or artificially socially intelligent advisor, it's going to help those potentially low performing teams. And I'll just end. We also coded the recommendations so that what the coaches, what the facilitators were doing is giving them guidance on what to do. And what we did was coded the guidance that was given according to team theory. So they're communicating with them. They're making things like theory of mind attributions. It seems like this, who appears to be maybe confused. So what the AI is doing is making recommendations, making inferences about teammates, or making inferences about the players and saying you should do something about this. The ASI sometimes gave motivational facilitation, like keep going, great job. Also recommended information sharing because we know that communicating across teammates is very good. It says you can help your team by telling them about this shortcut, or they would give recommendations about strategy. You should talk to so-and-so, or you should let teammates know about this other thing. So basically, out of the thousands of interventions, we came up with about a dozen categorical descriptions of them because we wanted to see how those were related to the performance. And just looking at this measures of interventions about information sharing, mission status update, motivation, and theory of mind. Just to wrap it up. Wait, where did I go? There it is. Looking at those interventions, correlating it with meaningful game metrics, you see that information sharing, that is the guidance given by the bots, highly correlated with mission score. Information sharing highly correlated with critical victims extraction, so those are the ones that give you the most points. Not correlated with regular victims, so you should rescue them, but that's not as important. Same thing with mission status update. Like you have so much time left, you've rescued so many victims. These are just things that teams should pay attention to. When the ASI is telling them about that, it helped them with their mission score and helped them with victim extractions just of the regular kind. But what we really wanted to show was this interesting finding. ASI that's giving motivational interventions sucked. You see it was negatively correlated with the performance across all of these metrics. So significant with mission scores, significant with critical victims. But the more interesting one was with theory of mind. ASI providing theory of mind, like it looks like you're lost or it looks like your teammate could use this help, that actually hurt performance as well. Interventions associated with theory of mind led to lower scores, lower critical victim extractions. So something about the ASI trying to engage in theory of mind behaviors, so we're still kind of unpacking this, could be related to the team profiles, that if it's already a good team and the ASI is saying, hey, you should pay attention to your teammates, that may be annoying to the humans or it may be interfering with things that they're already naturally doing. So I'll end here. Just note that this was a very large project. We were one team of dozens. The ASI to which I kept referring, there are actually 6 different AIs operating separately because part of this project was evaluating the actual cognitive architectures. So the ASI that was made represented 4 different universities and 4 private sector companies. We didn't even get into the differences, and there were hundreds of teams, but we didn't really get into, we just ignored or were agnostic to the different kinds of ASIs. I'm bringing this up because this is an important area of research. Because each one of these teams that made these artificial social intelligence, they had their own models behind it. They made independent models for predicting teammate behaviors. One was based upon story and narrative. One was specifically built on team processes. One was built on AI for leadership. But again, the point is they had different underlying architectures, so it would be interesting to see the degree to which these underlying architectures were different in how they affected overall performance. But again, we were ignoring that because we were interested in ASI in general. An important point we also talk about is the difference between a human advisor and an ASI advisor, where humans have certain advantages that the ASI compared to the ASI, but it's still important to recognize that the ASI was helping. If you looked at the data, if you remember, ASI was as good as the human advisor in improving the teams that we had predicted would do poorly. And then finally, when it comes to theory of mind in general, we had a very superficial kind of treatment of theory of mind. If you're familiar with the theory of mind literature, there's a lot going on, and we were interested in socially intelligent interventions. Remember, we wanted the ASI to artificial social intelligent. The advice it should be given should be socially intelligent. And we focus on that as our generic way to think about theory of mind, but there's a lot more going on with theory of mind. And if you're familiar with this, the Sally Ann task, false belief is a key part of theory of mind. We didn't even touch that. So that's a ripe area of research that people can do. I'll just skip that. Another part, when it comes to studying teams, there's dozens and dozens of frameworks and theories out there for teams. We didn't really address that in this project. We kept it at a very generic level. But when it comes to developing artificial social intelligence, there's a rich body of literature that anyone in computer science, anyone who's interested in developing these kinds of cognitive architectures can pay attention to and try to develop their AI based upon these. We didn't even touch this. We kept it, again, at a very generic level. So, not going to get into that. But yeah, we were a large team, many of different teams out there. And as I said, Reese and Jesse, these were the graduate students who did the lion's share of the work and had some other co-PIs, computer science. Our team itself was a blend of organizational scientists and computer scientists and cognitive psychologists. So it was a nice interdisciplinary team working on this project. I'll end it there.